Good evening. My name is Marian Archbold, and I am the president of University Women's Club of North York. Before we start, I'll briefly go over the Zoom protocols. This session is going to be recorded. Please remain muted. If for some reason your cat crawls across your computer or you spill your coffee, please check to see that you are still muted. Zoom is very strange at times. If you have questions, we ask that you place them in the chat. A Q&A session will follow the presentation. Thank you. We will now do the land acknowledgement. The members of the University Women's Club of North York respect and honor the traditional territories of our First Peoples across Canada. We understand that from time immemorial, Canada has been and is the home of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Through continually educating ourselves, we reflect on the enduring presence of our First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that today, these lands continue to be the shared territory of many diverse peoples from near and far. We recognize our present responsibilities are focused on further strengthening our ongoing commitment in action as we work together in a spirit of truth, collaboration, and reconciliation. I am very pleased tonight to welcome all CFUW members from across the country, our own University Women's Club of North York members, and invited guests. I am also thrilled and especially pleased to welcome our moderator, Caryn Lieberman from Global News, and our panelists, Claire Smith and her husband, Ken Price, and CFUW award winner, Casey Oliver. Tonight's meeting promises to be an eye-opener on how our comfortable lives can be turned upside down when we least expect it. Today is the 11th day in 16 days of global activism against gender-based violence. And tonight, therefore, is the 33rd anniversary of the 1989 Montréal Massacre at École Polytechnique. It is also the eve of the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women in Canada. Tonight, Caryn Lieberman of Global News will moderate a discussion with Claire Smith and Ken Price, whose 18-year-old daughter, Samantha, survived the 2018 Danforth shooting. For them, gun violence literally hit home. You will hear how this Danforth family turned tragedy into activism. Following, we will have our annual commemorative ceremony for the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. We will remember the 14 young women who lost their lives on December 6, 1989. Casey Oliver, one of the 2022 recipients of the CFUW École Polytechnique Award, will speak to us about how this award has impacted her life. I would now like to call upon Margaret McGovern to introduce our guest speakers.
Thank you, Marian. Good evening. Welcome to all members and guests. This is how gun violence hit home with me. Where were you on December the 6th, 1989? I was here in Toronto, but my daughter Tricia was at Queen's in Kingston in her first year. When I heard the news of the murders of 14 young women at Polytechnique, my first thought went to Kingston. Misogynistic actions perpetrated by engineering students were occurring on the Queen's University campus in 1989. For example, posters, "No means yes." I had difficulty reaching Tricia as she was not answering her phone. My son had died just 4 years before, so my surviving child was very precious to us. I did reach her eventually. Many of the students had spent time with support staff. Our conversation that night lasted 2 hours. most of my time listening. It is also why I continue to advocate for better gun control. I am sure there are other stories out there. I would like to introduce Caryn Lieberman, senior journalist with Global News Toronto and graduate of Concordia University in her native Montreal and the Poynter Institute in Florida. Caryn was awarded the RTNDA Adrienne Clarkson Award for Diversity for special coverage of Remembrance Day and Holocaust Education Week during her time at CP24. She has also worked for CT National News and Sun News Network. Caryn will moderate a discussion with Claire Smith and Ken Price. Claire Smith and Ken Price represent the Danforth Families for Safe Communities, which was founded in 2019 by survivors, victims' families, and community members affected by the mass shooting on the Danforth. With this group, Claire and Ken have advocated over the prevailing few years for measures that address gun violence in the tragedy. In Canada. Claire and Ken live in the Beaches neighborhood near the Danforth, where the tragedy occurred. They are married and have 2 university-aged children, one of whom is Samantha, who was shot and survived the shooting. Claire worked for the University of Toronto before leaving to raise their children, while Ken graduated from the University Western and has made a career in high tech, working for firms including Hewlett-Packard, Bell Canada, and Samsung Electronics. As you listen, ask yourself, how may I get involved in this? Caryn, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And it really is a privilege and a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. You know, I think back on July 22nd, 2018, and of course, my experience pales in comparison to what we'll hear from Claire and Ken. But as a side note, like so many others, I was at home on that evening, a hot summer evening, and I lived on the Danforth. And so I heard the sirens, and I heard the sirens like we heard on many other occasions. Only on this night, the sirens never stopped. And then I remember that my phone was buzzing and ringing, and it was a bizarre time for an assignment for me to be called in by my news director. And so I sort of instinctively had a feeling that something was happening, something was amiss. And of course, as soon as I picked up my phone, I, within minutes, was on the scene and met my cameraman there. And I will never forget the chaos. I will never forget the concern. But I was lucky in that, of course, my loved ones were safe at home when the shots rang out. And that was not the case for Ken and Claire, who are with us tonight and impacted on a level that I could never imagine. And I thank you both for being so candid and offering your insight and your experience with us tonight. And so, Claire, I'll start with you. And can you touch on the details of that night and tell us what happened?
Sure. Thank you, Caryn. I guess I'll just jump right in and just highlight a few things that we had to deal with that night. For us, it all began with a phone call from a stranger at about 10 o'clock. Ken and I got a call from someone who was using our daughter's cell phone to reach us. And this person told us that Samantha had been shot. We later learned that the call was made from a doctor who happened to be having dinner at a restaurant on the Danforth when our daughter crawled in from the street bleeding. The doctor managed to tend to Samantha's wounds as best as she could. And all I remember was feeling shock at the time. And Ken and I left our son at home and we raced to the nearest hospital, which was Michael Garron. But as we were en route to the hospital, we received another call from the doctor telling us that Samantha actually was being transferred to St. Mike's Hospital. So we spent some time at St. Mike's waiting at the trauma bay for any news of Samantha's condition. And I can tell you, there is no kind of relief like seeing your daughter alive, even though she was still scared and in a lot of pain. So over the course of a few days, we learned about the extent of what had happened on the street that night. And in a matter of about 15 minutes, 13 people had been injured by gunfire. 2 young girls were fatally shot, and the lone gunman had killed himself.
Your experience in terms of interacting with first responders and police, tell us about that and what happened right away, and then what did they eventually tell you, through the police report that was released. And I feel like there was a lag in that. And so what did you learn over the course of that time?
Sure. Well, initially we were quite amazed with the swift response from the police and EMS staff. We learned that there's actually a protocol in Toronto when shootings occur, and that victims are often sent to either St. Mike's or Sunnybrook hospitals, where trauma surgeons are ready to get to work. As for the police report, this was a much longer process for us to go through. It took detectives a year to complete their investigation. And during this year, several of the families reached out to the police for updates, but information really was not forthcoming. When we all finally met with detectives and Police Chief Mark Saunders a year after the shooting, it was verified that the handgun used in the crime was a Smith & Wesson M&P 40 semi-automatic handgun that had been legally imported to Canada and had been available for sale at a retail gun shop in Saskatchewan. The handgun was subsequently stolen from the shop and ended up being used in this crime on the Danforth. We also learned that although the shooter's brother had been involved in criminal activity, the shooter himself was a troubled soul, but did not have the same criminal history as his brother, and also had no gang affiliation and no apparent terrorist affiliation, and also no other ideological motive that police could uncover.
And I know we'll get into the Smith & Wesson and more about the firearm with Ken a little bit later. I want to, Claire, ask you though, as a mom, and Ken, I'm going to ask you as a dad as well, but we'll start with Claire. As a mom, talk about what it is like entering this uncharted territory, dealing with a child who's clearly experienced trauma. This is traumatic for her, this is traumatic for you, dealing with the care that Samantha required, hospitals, counseling, mental health. Walk us through that, Claire, and then Ken, I'm going to ask you as a dad what that was like for you as well.
Sure. I guess I could focus on some of the care that we received immediately after the shooting. Initially, Samantha spent a whole week in the hospital. She was quite lucky, quote unquote, that the single bullet that hit her traveled through her body and exited the front of her hip, missing her spine and any major arteries. And once Sam was home after that week, she did need a wheelchair and crutches for a while, and we were able to get Sam to a clinic to have regular dressing changes done. So it was quite an ordeal to deal with all of this at home. And these dressing changes, which a nurse had to do, continued even as we moved Samantha into residence at Western University that September, which is a testament to her determination to get on with her life. And as for counseling, we were handed a pamphlet from Victim Services, which I would say on our first interaction was not very helpful. However, later as a group, we had a bit better of an experience with the service. But basically, you have to rely on your own means for help. You're left to find private care, mostly on your own. We did try to get Sam to try a couple of different therapists close after the shooting, but one was actually not wheelchair accessible. just as we were about to get there, we found out, oh, we couldn't get her up the stairs. Had to cancel that. And another one used some methods that frankly weren't very helpful for us at the time. So needless to say, it took some months later before we reached out again to our family physician to find out if we could find some further support. And I would say, in fact, this last fall, we supported a private members bill at Queen's Park that would allow for survivors of gun violence to extend OHIP coverage for their mental health. And sadly, this bill was unanimously voted down by the Conservatives. So yeah, it's kind of.
Thank you,
So
Claire.
I think for me, going back to the first night, you want to do something immediately. It's your daughter, it's your child. You want to go to them, and you described this, I think the pandemonium that was happening. We're a few blocks away from that. Obviously, we weren't aware until the phone call came in, and then you want to jump into action. So I think the first feeling I have is one of it was frustrating because we couldn't get to her. We had to wait for the system to do its thing and get her into a place where she was stable enough to see us. And those first few hours were very difficult. It was probably 2 or 3 in the morning before we actually saw Samantha, as Claire described.
It's
And then
quite harrowing.
And then you're kind of cut off. I don't think we didn't realize what was happening. Plus, Samantha's phone was taken as evidence, so she was cut off. Like, you want to talk about the worst thing to happen to a teenage girl in any situation is to lose her phone. So we didn't know what had happened to other people, and you're very isolated. So that was frustrating. There's nothing to do about it. It's just what you go through. And we didn't discover, for example, that her friend had been killed until the next morning, and then we found out in the wrong way. It was just really horrible. And then I think in terms of the ongoing part, I think Claire described it accurately. You kind of can deal with the wound. You physically, they're really great. We are fortunate. We have all kinds of problems in our healthcare system, but we've got lots of great, competent doctors and surgeons that, and we got access to them because they're ready for this. In fact, we'll talk about the activism, some of them later, but that part of it was fine. But I think we still don't know whether we've done right by her in terms of her mental health or ourselves. You don't know. I think I'm surprised at how little knowledge there is. We knew there was a gap. You kind of, again, you're going along in your life and you're not encountering this, and then you have a trauma like this that's sudden and it affects you and your family. It's not possible. We don't know, whether. Samantha is also at a time in her life when many of you will remember, you kind of get 18, 19, 20, you're doing a lot of changing. You're developing as a young adult. So you don't know how to separate the normal anxiety from the new anxiety and what you should be doing about it. So I would say that part is still an unwritten chapter in all of this. And we may never know what, whether we've done as much as we can or could have. There's really no roadmap in this area.
Claire, can you tell us a little bit more about Samantha right now and maybe what she's up to and does she talk about it and how are you able to help her cope with it if it does come up in her life?
Yes, well, at the moment, Sam's with us at home. She's working and, she's seeing friends and trying to stay busy. I think it's a challenge because her parents are so involved with activism, and she has to hear us talk about this quite a bit. So, but she's used to it, and I think she's proud of us for stepping up and speaking out. But for herself, I think it's a private issue for her, and she's doing her best to live her life and to connect with the other people that she knows that were injured or affected by this shooting, which now is for most of it it's fading a little bit because it was 4.5 years ago. But yeah, it's tricky, but I'm very proud of her and her determination to stay, it's hard as a mom. You can see that she's lacking some confidence where she used to have that. And she doesn't travel as freely on transit like she used to. She's looking over her shoulder now, and that's changed. That's being taken away. That trust of community. Yeah, but day by day, it's.
And you just pinpointed how we're all impacted differently, right? When we experience trauma, all of us are impacted differently, and that's Samantha's experience, and yours, and Ken, and yours as well is unique in that you chose to stand up and do something because your daughter was impacted, your community was affected, and so I know that you now advocate for changes to gun policy in this country, and so tell us about the journey, and maybe start from the beginning and what prompted you to say, you know, this is something that I want to get involved with.
Sure. So well, it was shortly after the shooting in 2018 that we heard about some town hall meetings that were being held across the country by then Public Safety Minister Bill Blair. The meetings were a way for the Liberals to survey how Canadians felt about issues around gun violence. And so we decided to attend one of those meetings in Toronto, and soon discovered that the issue of gun violence is indeed a contentious one, with some groups advocating for changes to gun policy, some raising awareness to the social determinants of gun violence. And indeed, we were surprised to learn of a very vocal group of gun rights supporters. That was kind of a shock to witness that at this meeting. But anyway, it was around this time that Ken and I reached out to other families affected by the Danforth shooting, and we all felt like we couldn't just sit back and not get involved in some way. So it was February of 2019, some 7 months after the shooting, the group decided to hold a press conference at the Danforth Music Hall, which is where we met you, Caryn. And this was to help raise awareness to the government and the public about our experience with what the damage a handgun can do, and what indeed could be done to change this outcome from happening to other people. So we're proud of the fact that some of the younger women participated, including, we heard a very moving speech by then 16-year-old Quinn Fallon, whose sister Reese was killed that night. And by September of 2019, that same year, we decided to form Danforth Families for Safe Communities, initially as a support for one another, and also as a grassroots advocacy group. And the point really of the press conference and our follow on advocacy since has been to convey to the Prime Minister and key federal lawmakers that all of the Danforth that were in that group wanted action. Pretty much the same action that we're seeing represented in Bill C-21, which is before Parliament right now. We also have come to know many others connected to this issue. Other Danforth community members have come forwards, even recently. So, 4 years later, and we're still hearing from people who have been affected. Advocacy groups, politicians, all trying to go up against the industry-funded gun lobby. We should also mention that two of the groups we work closely with are directly connected to the cause that UWCNY is honoring tonight through support. The femicide at École Polytechnique caused the formation of the Coalition for Gun Control, which is supported by 200 organizations and is headed by Dr. Wendy Soukier of Toronto Metropolitan University. And there's a group like ours made up of survivors and families of victims of the École Polytechnique shooting called Police se souvient. Another noteworthy group was born out of the Danforth tragedy, and this is the Canadian Doctors for Protection from Guns. Dr. Najma Ahmed founded this group with Dr. Julie Maggi, Dr. Lynn Wilson, and Dr. Philip Berger. Dr. Ahmed, for those of you who don't know, is the trauma surgeon that looked after our daughter, and their group started speaking out around the same time that ours did. So these groups and other brave persons, mostly women and women's groups who came before us, have been critical this cause.
And the federal government has taken action in terms of legislation. Let's talk about that.
Sure. So I think, again, it's been a long journey, and it's been longer for others. As was discussed earlier, it's been 33 years for the women of Polytechnique and what they've tried to accomplish. And they, the first success was really culminated in 1995. So the bedrock of, let's say, Canadian gun legislation was formed by Alan Rock as Justice Minister and Anu Chrétien's government in around 95, when they defined and updated and modernized the idea of gun control, like what kinds of guns can people have, what do they have to go through to get it, describing different levels of ownership between unregistered and restricted and prohibited weapons and so on. And they also, though, introduced the ill-fated gun registry, which I think is a problem more of implementation than of idea, but it was certainly the issue that probably got the gun rights groups most upset. The idea of having to register your firearms with the state. Now, personally, I'm having a hard time reconciling that, given you have car licenses and you register your hockey for kids or kids for hockey and all of that stuff. But anyway, that seemed to be the straw, and that got a lot of the modern gun groups organized to take down some of the legislation. And then when the Conservatives came in, a lot of that was undone. And the only reason I bring that up is we entered the debate sometime after that, right? So now we've turned back to a Liberal government. They've run on a gun control, because guess what? More guns, less control, more gun violence problems, from our simple way of looking at it, from about 2015 at the end of the Conservative reign till now. And then you've got, things like record keeping and background checks that were allowed to, become much looser. So the first wave of gun legislation was to restore some of that in something called Bill C-21. But here was our first lesson. There's what the government says it will do. It's getting it through the law, and then it's getting it supported. It's like saying, here's the posted speed limit, and this is what we'll enforce it at, kind of thing. So we certainly lived through that with C-71. So the government restored a number of things, but it took a few years, in fact, only recently, to bring into force and to resource the very things they were going to do, which are kind of modest, which is have retailers maintain records that the police can inspect if they need to, and restore lifetime background checks, because you really need to understand the full history of somebody's well-being, mental well-being, before giving them a deadly weapon. So these kinds of things happen. Then fast forward to May of 2020, and on the heels of the most unfortunate and tragic events in Nova Scotia, the government was pushed then to finally do something about assault-style rifles, and announced through order in council that it would ban certain rifles, but that's kind of a temporary measure. So that brings us to Bill C-21, which is where we are now. So Bill C-21 is very comprehensive. It has a number of initiatives in it. It's not just the handgun ban or handgun freeze bill. It has a bunch of things. It does bring into law a supporting idea and structure around what is an assault style rifle. It does indeed freeze handguns, which we're in support of. We think, people have bought the guns on the premise that they were going to be legal, but it's grown 50, 60,000 a year. We've had more and more problems. It's just too easy to draw a line between the growth of the domestic supply, to see incidents of abuse, and to not conclude that we need to freeze this thing and reduce it over time, which is really what the idea of that is. But there are other things. There's an improvements in red flag and yellow flag laws. It gives women alternatives to just going to the police to raise an issue with the courts with respect to if they feel threatened in a home that has a firearm. There are more resources and better surveillance and stiffer penalties to help protect the borders, which people talk about, as I think all groups agree is required to deal with the issue of smuggling of guns. And this is in that bill. There are stiffer penalties. As I said, there's a Safer Communities Fund, to try to provide funding to neighborhoods that are at great risk. And there's some attempt to regulate the air gun industry and to regulate parts. So these are lesser, probably more nitty-gritty kinds of deals, but they're hugely important. Gun parts, for example, just being able to buy gun parts allows you to complete a ghost gun that you've made on a 3D printer. And this is coming. This is coming as a problem, and they're trying to get ahead of it. So we support Bill C-21, frankly, not just because of the handgun freeze, but because it has all of those things in it. Now, where are we? So so everybody remember their civics training. So you go through 2 readings in the House, and then you go to committee. And committee is where, this is where the mud wrestling begins, around, especially in a minority government, around what will live and get amended and so on. And that's where we're at with this. And there's a very vocal debate. I don't want to take up we take up the entire rest of this hour talking about where we are on what's called amendment number 4 that the government has put forward to try to define what an assault style rifle is and what the reaction has been. But listen, it's a worthwhile debate to have, and I'm glad we're having it, and I hope we get out of it. And we're really counting on the Liberals need to support, now not to get political here, but we really need the support of the Bloc and the NDP to get this thing out of committee and to get it supported and to move it forward. It's a minority government. We're hoping that we'll come to consensus and have that go forward. But that's where we are, Caryn.
Well, I think that helps a lot because it shows us, I mean, it's such a process, right? It's such a process. And just like grief is, just like dealing with trauma, healing, and then making change happen, right? It's all part of the process. And I know that part of the process for you as well is a lawsuit. And so I wanted to get into the lawsuit that your group has launched against Smith & Wesson and why.
Yeah, so this story starts where we're approached by a lawyer. So with all due respect to whoever might be on this call, there's rarely a story that starts that way that ends well. But no, I'm just kidding. So I think we had to consider, there are 2, I think this has been a learning journey, Caryn, and you mentioned that for us, like learning how to deal with what happened to us, learning about the political process from scratch. And then we didn't even think about this because, again, you think of just, you sue somebody, that's really an American thing, but there is a role the courts can play, and you have to determine how that role can be played. You can use existing laws to make change. And the part that was interesting to me about being approached, and we were approached, was, as a kind of product marketing guy, why aren't guns safer? What is being done? With smartphone, look through the smartphone. I can't imagine having a smartphone now that doesn't have some basic security on it, that says I'm me and I can get into that phone. And there's a lot of infrastructure around that, and it ain't perfect, but it's better than it used to be with flip phones. You now have protections. And as guns have become more powerful, there's really none of that that's happened. And, there is technology that can do that. And what we learned is that this debate was coming to a head in the United States in the 90s. At the end of the 90s, they were all of the gun manufacturers being compelled under legislation that the Clinton administration was putting forward to force them to implement smart gun technology. And in fact, Smith & Wesson was leading in this regard. They filed patents, they had workable designs in our opinion. But then the administration changed, the gun lobby, really, and as strong as the gun lobby is here, it is just a whole other level through the NRA, and they got their way. They basically undid this. They had laws put into place so that gun manufacturers in the United States are not liable for misuse of their product, as they call it. There have been workarounds that we've seen, but that's fundamentally still in place. Of course, the Second Amendment has been reinterpreted and misinterpreted. So you have all kinds of pressures that have allowed the gun industry to go unchecked, but none of that is true here. We don't have a Second Amendment. We don't have, the same constraints, and bringing a case forward in the Canadian context is not only, we think, possible, but I think necessary to send a message that smart gun technology could have been implemented. It existed, in our opinion, could have been implemented and should have been. It was foreseeable that a gun stolen in one part of the country would be used in a crime in another part by a person who should never have been able to use that gun. And there should have been a deterrent. There wasn't, and that's our contention, and that's what the role of our lawsuit is. But this is another one where you talk about time. So we filed this in 2019. The judge took a while and then said, okay, we're going to have to certify this, and you go through a certification process. He said, this is really complex. We're going to split this into 2. We had the first part, kind of certified a year and a half after that, and we're still waiting to get the second part. So we're not even in the arena. And never mind having the game start, right? We're not even certified, and the certification timeline now is early 2024.
The wheels of justice.
Yeah, the wheels of justice. Yes.
Yeah.
It works on its own time.
Right.
But, again, we've discovered a lot of things, and this the legal team at Gowlings, headed by Malcolm Ruby, has done unbelievable work on our behalf and discovered things that I think will be helpful. There's certainly a relationship between the lawmakers and the law and the application of the law. And I feel good about the fact that we've been supported enough and have found people to help us to use all of those institutions to try to bring change.
I'd love to actually pick up on support. And Claire, I'll ask you about this. You mentioned earlier some of the doctors groups. We know that with the doctors groups, with City of Toronto representatives at the Danforth Families for Safe Communities has advocated about the need to view and remedy the issue of gun violence. And this is from a public health lens. So can you speak to that?
Sure, yes. So while DFSC has advocated for the need to view and remedy this problem from a public health lens, as you mentioned, yes, the City of Toronto did pass a motion in 2020 to support this view. And the doctors group, the Canadian Doctors for Protection from Guns, had called for this. So the issue of gun violence really does affect the public at large, as we know. And we need to look at this problem in the same manner as other public health issues like smoking, impaired driving, or automobile safety. We need a combination of law, healthcare interventions, and root cause analysis and remedies. The point is, unlike what some say, it's not just about more resources for the police or just going after the bad guys. Gun violence is an outcome of hate. And we need to look at the root causes of that hate. And at the same time, the ease of access to the kinds of guns most often used to commit those acts of hate. So I think it also means that we have to remember and respect that guns are first and foremost lethal weapons. Sometimes the language around hunting and sport shooting makes guns seem benign and harmless, but guns are about harm. And that's why we think gun control is part of a public health response. Just like restricting where you can smoke or having zero tolerance for impaired driving. So we have to do more than just respond to gun violence. We're not going to arrest our way out of this problem, and we need to do things proactively. And it makes sense to ban the kinds of firearms that are most used in the commission of these acts of hate as one proactive step to solve gun violence.
And what about politics? What have you learned, Claire and Ken, or whomever feels comfortable talking about this? What have you learned about the political process that you have to deal with, that you have to go through when you're advocating for something like this?
Well, I think, first of all, we've been, I don't know, pleasantly surprised, the wrong term, but I think it's not as hard as you think it is. Like, I think the MPs want to hear from you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, honestly,
they hear from us
and
a lot.
And sometimes, sometimes they're not going to take your first call or whatever, but on matters that are important, they're going to eventually hear from you, and they're and even there are people in the political staffs and the bureaucracy that I think they count on it. Like, as with the further along we've come, you realize they're just people doing it, trying to do the best they can for public service, and they enter for all the right reasons, and they need your input. Like, if you have a point of view, if you can take the time to add value through research or advocacy or whatever, they count on it, quite frankly, whatever that cause is. And our cause, we were not gun experts or gun legislation, and we're still not really, but we certainly have taken the time to become more educated and knowledgeable. We've tried to be constructive, and I think the process is open to that. And I think it would make people less cynical if they participated more.
And that's exactly, that might be my last question for you both, is what would you tell everybody who's here this evening and listening in about how they too can get involved in whatever cause they're passionate about or impacted by? The two of you prior to this shooting probably never imagined that this is where you would be. This is what you'd be advocating for. But this is now your life. You've been thrown into it. And so what would your message be to everyone else about being involved?
Well, I think I'm sure there is something. There is something that you have experienced in your life, and if you speak authentically, constructively, and from your experience. I mean, the other thing that we have consciously tried not to do is to get into the mudslinging, that can happen. You can get drawn into that. And social media can be a terrible place to try to have a debate, but it can also be constructive. You can learn a lot if you choose to use it that way. So I think all of these barriers of, well, I can't make a difference or it's going to be too awful are things that you should check. Because I think in our experience, by being involved, we've learned that you can, I think, hold your head high, whatever you can take the high road. And for us, I think we've been able to make a difference. And I think there's even a grudging respect on the other side of the table, because we have proceeded the way we have, as difficult as that is sometimes. So I'm sure there's something, and look at with the internet and Zoom and and a small investment in a website, you can make a big difference. It's amazing. That's what I would say.
Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Claire, for your candid commentary and for sharing your story. I'm going to call on Isabel now, who's going to step in and moderate a question and answer period with our guests.
Hello. So if you haven't already done so, please go to chat and enter your questions, okay? And I'll be reading from there. I do have a few to start us off. Can you explain to us how you went about engaging politicians?
Sure. Well, okay. So we did have one advantage. Like, our daughter isn't terribly political, but the reason she was with that group of kids that were on the Danforth that night was they were all kind of young liberals. So maybe we had a little bit of a leg up because because our local MP knew who our daughter was. He didn't know us, and he didn't know our group, that's for sure. So that helped. So is my message, get your kids involved? No, I think it is. I think it's, but we had to take this step, like it's just deciding, I'm entitled to this. We're entitled to be heard. We're entitled to be heard by our MP, and we're going to go and have that conversation. And that's how we got started. It wasn't, I think, terribly. I think we hold these institutions maybe at a length, or it's somebody else's job, or it's too far of a gap between my home and that place. But it's not as big a chasm. And as I said, I think people want to hear from you. You'd be surprised. I think that the people on the other side, they're far more interested in hearing from you than you think. So just do it. I think is the big lesson there. It's more accessible than you think it is.
You're speaking to the converted in this.
Yeah, good.
Okay, so I have a question here that says, since Canadians do not have the right to own guns as Americans do, what is the rationale for any assault guns being allowed in Canada? Other than for mass killings, what would they be used for?
Well, here's the one fact that we learned. I mean, Canada is a very heavily armed nation. Like, we are a nation of hunters and gun owners. There are, and because of the gun registry no longer being in place, which is sad, we go by estimations and surveys, but there's probably 10-12 million guns out there because most of them are not registered. Ones that are registered are the high-end rifles and shotguns and the handguns. So, I mean, I think we've asked the same question. Okay, then, well, let's say you say, you look at the kinds of guns used in the United States and in the instance in Canada, like a poly, and you say, why does somebody need a gun that powerful that can take that many lives in such a short amount of time, with the kind of ammunition, like kind of the way the magazine feeds the gun and so on, and how many bullets you can have? Why does somebody need to be able to do that, if they're just hunting? And I think that's the debate we're having now. So the answer is, in our view, you don't need them. But the tricky part is, how do you define that? If you decide to take a Canadian set of values against that, we also don't make the guns that we use, right, anymore. We import them all. So they're all made for different markets. And so now you're imposing, your set of values on those kinds of designs, and people have been influenced by the marketing on those kinds of designs as well. So right now, what they're trying to define it by power, by the size of the of the gun itself and the kinds of bullets that it uses and the caliber of the weapon. And they're also trying to define it. This is probably the trickiest part, by how many bullets the gun can accept at once. Because we have a law that says that a rifle can only accept five rounds at once, but there are third-party manufacturers of much larger magazines for sale and other ways that you can get around that. And they're trying to ban the guns that are most likely to accept those multi-round, semi-automatic, center fire, high powered, with a certain joules of energy in terms of the projectiles coming out of the end. But even if you say that, there's still lots of stuff in the middle, like just in the mushy middle of a lot of people that have bought those for hunting, even though they probably shouldn't have. It's like the guy on the golf course with the massive driver. Should he have that really? Is that still a sport? I don't know, but he could. So he did it. She did it, so that's kind of where we are with the guns is, somebody's assault rifle is another person's hunting rifle, and they're using the language with equal force. So I think, I hope that, it's going to come down to the specification and then a list, and there'll probably be some exceptions, and there'll be some unhappy campers on both sides of it, but we'll get there. But it's absolutely necessary. Like there's no way, like in that 10 million, that you need the kinds of the average. Listen, I grew up. I got to say that I'm going to play my small town. I grew up in Central Ontario, in Orillia, Ontario. And lots of hunters, lots of hunting, lots of exposure to guns. Nobody had a handgun. Nobody had one of these AR-15 derived, rifles. They didn't need it. And so I think the average hunter, but we don't hear from the average hunter. We hear from the people who have extreme views on firearms, and I think that's part of the problem. But the government's they're going to have to just kind of bully their way into this thing and get these things out of society, and we'll be better off for it.
So there was a quote from Pierre Trudeau that said to one of the hunters, "You have to be a really bad shot to need one of those."
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think we've all decided that there are prohibited weapons, right? I mean, machine guns are prohibited. So it's not the fact that everybody can't agree that some guns are too powerful. I think it's just where do you draw the line, and that's the issue. And the problem is when you don't deal with something for 20 years. Technology moves on, marketplaces just happen. And frankly, now we're paying the price for that, because a lot of people have just pushed the envelope, and, the gun industry isn't going to hold back. That's for sure. Especially parked next door to who we're parked next door to, right?
Of course. So what are some of the arguments you've heard from the pro-guns group? Do they deviate at all from the US group? And I'm just going to add a little bit.
I think it kind of mostly goes like this, which is, we are legal gun owners, and you're coming after us and our legal and peaceful use of these. But our challenge to that is that, Mark Lepine had a registered right to hold the guns that he had, and he acted out. And the person that took the lives of the people in the Quebec mosque was a registered gun owner. There's a long list of people who have at one point been judged to be a legal gun owner who have acted badly. And there are lots of examples of people who hold gun licenses that divert guns into the illegal supply. So I think that, the argument is leave us alone, we don't cause any problem. And we would say, nah, that's not true. It just isn't. And therefore, and we didn't come into this with any kind of opinion on that matter. We were uneducated, but completely about the issue until it came into our living room. And therefore, we take issue with that. But I feel disappointed that there's not more responsibility taken or suggestions on the safety side. Well, I've got family too, and here's what if it happened to you, I think maybe you'd take a different attitude. Is my hope in terms of the folks. But largely they argue it's not their problem. They're peaceful, law-abiding, and it's not true all the time, unfortunately. And that's what we're up against.
Is there much influence from the American NRA to fight the right to own any type of gun in Canada?
Well, I think you find the rhetoric, comes up in some groups. So like the CCFR has become the most vocal, I guess. It tries to represent itself that way. The Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. Even the idea of firearm rights is an American idea. It's not an idea held in Canada. There are firearm rights. There's the privilege and the granting of a use of firearm through the law, but there's not a right to have firearms. So you see some of that rhetoric come north, and you can't help. We receive a lot of the same common media, and you see the marketing. Actually, one of the things that I did to get educated was just simply type in firearms for sale in Google and just look at what came back on search, and you can become pretty educated pretty quickly in terms of how guns are marketed, and you'd be pretty surprised. There's not a lot of mention of safety or, this is a really great hunting rifle. There's a lot of language in there that's very violent, in my opinion. And, I'm not trying to judge all of that stuff, but it's just a fact. And it's coming from the attitude I think they have in the United States as a product of their attitude towards arms. It's too bad.
I have another question here. A major study in the US found that mental illness is not the main cause of mass shootings. Can you comment on that?
Right. Yes. I know I've been reading a little bit about that today, and yeah, that's a tough one because, it's not always the fact that mass shootings happen due to someone's complete mental instability. It's often the fact there's an easy access to guns. This is what we hear about and read about in studies, that, people can sometimes have those social determinants we were talking about in their lives where they may not have access to better housing or education or healthcare, and, and live in perhaps a community where they don't feel supported in the way they should, and maybe they did sometimes need those mental health supports that would be required, when something happens to them. Even at school, sometimes we see kids that reach out and lash out in that venue, and they're not heard at a time when they're vulnerable and do need that support. So, yeah.
But I might add that, none of the mass shootings in Canada that I'm aware of have been carried out by people with a history of mental illness. That's been hate that has driven them to that motive. Like, because we need a label, hate or whatever complex thing was going on in their mind. I think it's another cop-out. Like, here's another excuse. Oh, it's either criminals, like we can identify them. Like, it's either criminals or the mentally ill. That's the problem. This is an often heard refrain, I think, from the gun lobby to not accept responsibility for, gun violence that happens in this country.
Thank you. Caryn, do we have time for one more question? Yep. Okay. We saw an increase in misogyny and hate during the so-called trucker convoy. Did you notice any change in the conversation around gun control at that time or since then?
Not really. I think we just recognized it. Like, clearly there is a core of individuals that have very libertarian values that live in our country. And the gun debate attracts some of that, for sure. I think that was a surprise we had. I guess we kind of knew that, but didn't really internalize it until we got involved. Like, how much guns are about more than guns. And I think even in the United States, like, guns are some kind of symbol of freedom, or my last line of defense against a corrupt government that's rising up to take my stuff and my citizenship and my freedoms. Like, the gun debate attracts that kind of same rhetoric that we saw in the convoy. So I'm not sure that I'd say that we saw different, but I think, or heightened or a change. I think it shifted, but it shifted against another framework that it seemed to attract some of the same kind of dialogue, which was frightening.
Sorry.
Okay.
So I think this is going to be our last question. Weapons of war are used to cause massive deaths and have no place in our peaceful society, especially in the hands of unstable people who hate. this is a comment. It's a no-brainer. Sorry, not a question here. So anyone have any other questions? I have a question here in terms of who, I think you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate a bit, is who else is involved in the Danforth Families for Safe Communities?
Oh, sure. Well, I think first of all, the first group was obviously the families themselves, and as we reached out, but I'll tell you, we have not reached out to every family, and not every family has wanted to be part of this, a part of what we've done. You know, it was like Danforth, as you know, and that night, Sunday night, it was people in the neighborhood, not in the neighborhood, some people who lived there and didn't, who happened to be enjoying a beautiful summer evening on a Sunday, you know, at 10 o'clock at night. So not all of the groups, but the Kozas family, the Fallon family who lost their children, in the beginning, Daniel Kane and Jerry Pinkson, who were affected, who were the doctors or the nurses in training. You know, the families connected with the group that we were part of. Ali Demerican, who was one of the victims, who was trying to help Reese when she was shot, and he was shot himself. So these are some of the direct people, I would say, families that have been involved really from the beginning and continue to support us, whether as spokespeople or not. But then what we noticed is that other people put up their hand and said, we want to be involved because, like, say, Caryn, they lived on the Danforth, and said, man, that really, if you guys are doing something about it, I'm in. You know, and then we have had other people that have just, who were kind of on their own, who have also come in and you know, so, and we're not, you know, we're a super formal hierarchical group. Like, we're just a bunch of families who are trying to make a change. And so we're not super exclusive on our membership. If people want to come in and become part of what we're trying to do, I'm sure we would love to have whoever has a strong opinion on this. Because there was one thing about, like, I feel like that's a community street, you know, like it belongs to Toronto, you know, and that was, we were reminded of that by so many people that came out to support, especially at the beginning, the memorial and the ad hoc activities and the concert that occurred on that bands put together, that we couldn't believe the outpouring. And it's because they were trying to reclaim, this is our neighborhood, and we want to remind people of that. And that's what makes the Danforth so special in our mind. And so our membership has tended to, you know, membership such as it is has tended to come and go. There have been a few of us that have been more willing to speak than others, but we do have a number of groups that individuals that help us out, and we're proud of what we've been able to get done, and we're proud of the bravery, particularly the Kozas and Fallon family as well, to, you know, to live with what they're living with, and to be supportive of what we're doing. I think is we have never lost sight of the respect we have for them for that. Anyway, thank you for asking.
Thank you. Did gender play a role in the Danforth shooting?
Sorry?
Did gender?
Oh, gender, I'm sorry. Well, you know, this is a question because we heard some reporting that suggested that he passed over men and seemed to be aiming for the group of that my daughter was part of was seven women and a man. You know, he shot 4 of the women. He shot, but he did shoot some other males, and so it's hard to say. Like, you know, the police didn't conclude anything, right? And so I'm now guilty of passing along some of the secondhand information that we had. It's not clear, but it's not lost on us as well that this is in the same year that the van, you know, the terrible incident in North York, right? So I don't think we have a clear answer, and I'm not sure we're ever going to know, and it's because of the fact that he took his life, and the family has really never said anything about what they know. So I think we're just going to have to live with that ambiguity.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is the end of the time that I have allocated for questions. So who am I passing on to now?
Thanks,
Over
Caryn.
for me.
Thank you. Thanks, Caryn.
And thank you, Isabel. Some thoughts right now about how December 6th, 1989 has changed our understanding about violence against women. It precipitated a cultural shift in thinking about gender-based violence. 14 young women were murdered because they were women, a crime of femicide. The victims of what became known as the Montréal Massacre are remembered, their lives cut short when a man entered L'École Polytechnique and systematically shot every young woman he encountered. The killer was motivated by a misogyny whose roots go far beyond one man and one day. On the eve of the 33rd anniversary of the Montreal Massacre, we remember the women and all of the victims and survivors of gender-based violence. We will observe a moment of silence as their names are read aloud. The white rose symbolizes the 14 victims.
Geneviève Bergeron, Hélène Colgan, Nathalie Croteau, Barbara Daigneault, Anne-Marie Edward, Maud Haviernik, Maryse Laganière, Maryse Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelletier, Michel Richard, Annie Saint-Arnaud, Annie Turcott, Barbara Kluznik-Vodajevic.
Tonight's event is a fundraiser in support of the Canadian Federation of University Women Charitable Trust. Each year, the Trust presents 3 awards to women pursuing graduate studies. The total value of the awards is $19,000. 2 awards of $7,000 are designated for doctoral studies, and 1 award for master's level study in any field relevant to women. I am pleased to welcome Casey Oliver, one of the 2022-2023 recipients of this award. She is a PhD candidate in clinical psychology at Lakehead University. Casey's dissertation focuses on sexual violence that is perpetrated through technology against women. She seeks to better understand whether this type of gender-based violence affects both the mental well-being of women and their use of technology. Casey will share the profound impact of being a recipient of this award. Casey.
Thank you so much for that. And just making sure my audio is working perfect. Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Casey and I'm so very honored to be here with everyone tonight and also to be this year's recipient of the 1989 École Polytechnique Award. It's also very bittersweet to receive such an award, especially when we think about what it commemorates, the murder of the 14 women whose names were just read. These were all aspiring post-secondary women, just like myself. So it makes, accepting and having this award especially bittersweet. So being the recipient of this year's award has had a tremendous impact on me and my research. So I am an aspiring feminist psychologist. So one day, hopefully soon, I'll be working with women through psychotherapy and also through my research. And as Marianne mentioned, my research is investigating technology and its use as a weapon against women, particularly when it comes to sexual violence. So this award sends the message that my research and my education are important. Graduate school is really difficult, and sometimes I want to throw the towel in, just like some of my peers. But when you have the support of other Canadians in a community, it really makes all the difference. And knowing that CFUW and others really value this type of research on gender-based violence really motivates me to keep going. And also, this is especially the case when we're talking about an award like the Polytechnique Award, because we're talking about an award that represents a life-shattering event for women who were unable to continue their pursuit of higher education. So this award also says that my voice is important and that the women who are participating in my research, their voices are also important. So I'll be interviewing women about their experiences of sexual violence through technology. And with this award, I'm able to pay them, which is also really important because often women either haven't been engaged in research or they aren't compensated for their participation. And kind of on a larger scale, right, it really shows that there is an investment in this type of research so that we can, collectively go towards that goal of preventing gender-based violence in Canada and globally. And the last thing I'll mention is just that it really allows me to focus on this area of research that I'm very passionate about. My research started in domestic homicide, so the killing of an intimate partner at the hands of typically a male perpetrator. And since then, I've been very driven to learn more about gender-based violence. And in graduate school, you can often get sidetracked. There's always multiple projects on the go. And for financial security, often students will rely on those side projects. But this award allows me to stay focused and to stay driven on my passion project, which is sexual violence through technology and better understanding it. So the financial security that this award provides me with is something that really helps to kind of reduce those barriers. And I think in general, when we're talking about women graduate students, there's already enough barriers for us. So these are all really tangible results, or what I see as tangible results of being the recipient of this year's award, though I can't speak yet to how something like this will look on my CV or resume in terms of career, future employers. But I think that that will also be an asset in that sense to help progress my career as a feminist psychologist. So for all of these reasons, I really encourage everyone to, support the Charitable Trust in whatever way you can. There's many other students like me who are in pursuit of their dreams and their goals, and having that financial security as well as the means to be able to engage women in research is huge and impactful. So thank you so much to the CFUW for helping to fund my dissertation. And I'm looking forward to showing you all the fruits of my labor, hopefully one day soon.
You have heard what an impact and how important this award is to Casey, how important it is to her work. And I just have to say, having had a daughter go through graduate school, you have no idea how important awards like ours are to the financial stability for these students carrying on their studies. It is critical and absolutely important to their financial well-being and carrying out this important work that is really necessary to understanding, in this case, the background and the basis for gender-based violence. To donate to this award, we ask that you visit CFUW Charitable Trust.ca and click on Donate. You will also receive a follow-up email after the event. I would like to ask Janet Gordon now to thank our guests.
First of all, Casey, congratulations on receiving one of CFUW's École Polytechnique Commemorative Awards. Thanks so much for taking time from your busy schedule to describe the impact of receiving that award. We're all very glad it's helped you out with your research and in staying focused, and wish you well for your dissertation and in your future endeavors. I urge all our members to contribute if they can to this worthy cause. And Claire and Ken, thank you. Thank you for bringing your story to us. We've learned a lot tonight. Your story reinforces this club's resolve in advocating for banning of guns in our city and across Canada. Our hearts go out to you. We are very impressed that you have turned such a stressful and exhausting and terrible experience into effective political action. We promise you that our club will continue to advocate for stricter gun laws, and especially for the passing of Bill 21. And Caryn, thank you. Thank you for sharing your skills and your passion with us tonight, both in leading our memorial to those lost young women and in conducting the interview with Ken and Claire. Very much appreciated.
The book giveaway tonight is Because They Were Women, written by José Beaulieu. This is the 30th anniversary account of the Montréal Massacre, memorializing the lives of the 14 women who were murdered on December 6, 1989, because they were women. This definitive account of the tragic day forced us to reckon with the violence against women in our culture. The murder was motivated by a misogyny whose roots go far beyond one man and one day. The book giveaway winners are Esther Semple from Guelph and Colette Simpson from Toronto. The books were donated by Second Story Press. This ends our meeting. I want to add my thanks to Janet, to Casey, to Caryn, and to Ken and Claire. It's been a very fascinating evening, and I especially want to thank Claire and Ken for sharing such a deeply personal story. I admire your courage, and I admire your activism for taking from your personal tragedy action that is your chance to do something positive about what could have been a devastating downturn in your family lives. And I just hats off to both of you for doing this and to bringing your community together to work on it. I think we all absolutely admire you for what you have done.